So, picture this. I'm the woman who's basically the human equivalent of a cozy sweater. Comfortable, slightly frayed at the edges, but still holding it together. My life wasn't exactly glamorous, but it was mine, and I was content. Not thrilling, mind you, but content. Like, I had a routine. I knew where the good parking spots were at the grocery store. I had a favourite mug. That's basically adulthood, right? Anyway, I was married to Greg. Greg was fine. He wasn't terrible, but he wasn't exactly lighting my world on fire either. He was the kind of guy who thought date night meant going to the same Italian restaurant every Friday and ordering the exact same thing. Chicken parmesan, no parsley, extra marinara on the side. Romantic, right? But hey, I loved him. Or at least, I thought I did. Looking back, maybe I just loved the idea of him. Or maybe I just loved that he didn't judge me for eating an entire pizza by myself while watching the Great British Bake Off. Love is complicated, okay? Greg had his quirks, though. Oh boy, did he have quirks. For starters, he was obsessed with organisation, and not in a cute, let's colour code the bookshelf kind of way. No, this man had a system for everything. Our pantry looked like it belonged in a museum exhibit titled The Neurotic Mind of a Middle-Aged Man. Everything was labelled, alphabetised, and arranged by expiration date. Once, I moved the canned soup to a different shelf, and you'd think I'd committed a war crime. He spent an hour reorganising it while muttering under his breath like a mad scientist. I'm pretty sure he had a spreadsheet for the spice rack. A spreadsheet. But, I loved him. Or at least I tolerated him. We had our little routines, our inside jokes, our shared Netflix queue. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Or so I thought. Let me paint you a picture of a typical day in the life of Maggie and Greg. I'd wake up, stumble into the kitchen, and make coffee while Greg was already at the table, reading the news on his iPad and eating a bowl of oatmeal that looked like it had been prepared by a robot. No sugar, no fruit, just oatmeal. He'd glance up, give me a nod and say, "Morning, Mags." Not good morning, not hey beautiful, just morning, Mags. Like I was his co-worker or something. But hey, at least he acknowledged my existence, right? Then I'd head to work. I'm a graphic designer, by the way, freelance, which basically means I spend half my time designing logos and the other half arguing with clients who think Comic Sans is a legitimate font choice. Greg worked in finance, which suited him perfectly because he loved spreadsheets more than he loved me. Okay, that's not fair. He didn't love spreadsheets more than me. It was probably a tie. Evenings were fine. We'd eat dinner, usually something I cooked because Greg's idea of cooking was microwaving a frozen burrito, watch TV, and then go to bed. Sometimes we'd talk, but mostly we just coexisted. It wasn't exciting, but it was comfortable, like a pair of old slippers. Sure, they're not stylish, but they're reliable. And then, out of nowhere, Greg decided to set those slippers on fire. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's rewind a bit. A few months before the incident, Greg got an invitation to his high school reunion. I didn't want to go. I mean, who actually wants to go to a high school reunion? It's just a bunch of middle-aged people pretending their lives are way more exciting than they actually are. But Greg insisted. He said it would be fun. Spoiler alert, it was not fun. So I put on a dress that made me look like a semi-functional adult, plastered on a smile, and went to the reunion with Greg. It was exactly what you'd expect. Bad punch, awkward small talk, and a DJ playing songs that were popular 20 years ago. Greg spent most of the night talking to his old classmates, including Jessica, his high school sweetheart. The one who got away. Or, more accurately, the one who dumped him for the captain of the football team and then moved to another state. Yeah, that Jessica. I tried to be cool about it. I really did. But every time I looked over, Greg and Jessica were laughing like they were in some rom-com montage. Meanwhile, I was stuck talking to a guy who kept bragging about his timeshare in Florida. It was a long night. And then, a few weeks later, Greg dropped the bomb. He sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where he ate his sad oatmeal every morning, and said the words that would change my life forever. I'm leaving you for Jessica. Cue the record scratch. So, let's talk about the high school reunion. Because, of course, that's where it all started. The catalyst. The moment my life went from comfortably boring to what even is my life anymore. Greg got the invitation in the mail. Yes, actual mail, because apparently his high school class was still living in 1998. It was one of those fancy envelopes with cursive writing on the front, like it was a wedding invitation or a summons to jury duty. Greg opened it, read it, and immediately said, "We're going." I stared at him. "We?" "Yeah," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "It'll be fun." Fun. Fun. High school reunions are not fun. They're a minefield of awkward small talk, forced nostalgia, and people you haven't seen in 15 years asking you invasive questions like, "So, what are you up to these days?" while secretly judging you for not being a CEO or a reality TV star. But Greg was insistent. He said it would be a good opportunity to catch up with old friends. Translation: he wanted to show off his moderately successful life and his moderately attractive wife. That's me, by the way. So, against my better judgment, I agreed to go. I even bought a new dress for the occasion, a black number that made me look like I had my life together, or at least like I had a decent credit score. Greg wore the same suit he wears to every formal event, which is fine, I guess, if you're into the whole generic businessman aesthetic. The night of the reunion, we arrived at the venue, a banquet hall that smelled like stale bread and desperation. There was a sign at the entrance that said, "Welcome, class of 2005, in glittery letters, which was both tacky and vaguely threatening. Inside, the room was decorated with balloons and streamers, like someone had thrown a party for a 5-year-old and then forgot to clean up. There was a DJ playing hits from the early 2000s, which was both nostalgic and deeply depressing. Greg immediately started mingling with his old classmates, leaving me to fend for myself. I grabbed a glass of punch, which tasted like someone had dissolved Skittles in water, and tried to look like I was having a good time. Spoiler alert, I was not having a good time. The first person I talked to was a woman named Karen. Yes, her name was actually Karen. She was wearing a dress that was approximately 3 sizes too small, and had the energy of someone who had just discovered essential oils. She spent 10 minutes telling me about her small business. It was an MLM, and then tried to recruit me to sell leggings. I politely declined and made a mental note to avoid her for the rest of the night. Next, I ran into a guy named Dave, who kept bragging about his timeshare in Florida. "It's a great investment," he said, like I had asked for his financial advice. "You should really look into it." I nodded politely and pretended to be interested, but inside I was screaming, "Please, someone save me." Meanwhile, Greg was having the time of his life. He was laughing and joking with his old classmates like he was the king of the reunion. And then I saw her, Jessica. Greg's high school sweetheart, the one who got away, or more accurately, the one who dumped him for the captain of the football team and then moved to another state. Jessica was exactly what I expected. Tall, blonde, and effortlessly gorgeous. She was wearing a red dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and she had a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. She was the kind of woman who could make you feel bad about yourself just by existing, and Greg was loving it. I watched from across the room as Greg and Jessica talked and laughed like they were the stars of their own rom-com. Every time I tried to join the conversation, Jessica would give me a polite smile and then immediately turn her attention back to Greg. It was like I was invisible. Or worse, like I was the third wheel in my own marriage. At one point, I overheard Jessica say, "Greg, you haven't changed a bit." And Greg replied, "Neither have you, Jess." Cue the eye roll. I mean, come on, that's straight out of a bad movie. But Greg was eating it up. He was grinning like an idiot, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head. What if? What if? What if? I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just nostalgia, that Greg was just catching up with an old friend. But deep down, I knew something was off. Greg had this look in his eyes, a look I hadn't seen in years. It was the look of a man who was remembering what it felt like to be young and carefree and in love. And it wasn't directed at me. The rest of the night was a blur. I drank too much punch, made awkward small talk with people I barely remembered, and tried to ignore the growing pit in my stomach. Greg, on the other hand, was having the time of his life. He was the life of the party, the king of the reunion, the guy who had it all. And I was just there. When we finally left, Greg was buzzing with excitement. "That was great," he said, like he had just won the lottery. "Did you see Jessica? She looks amazing." "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "She looks great." And that was it. That was the beginning of the end. So, let's fast forward a few weeks after the high school reunion. Life had gone back to normal, or at least what passed for normal in my world. Greg was back to his usual routine, eating his sad oatmeal, organising the pantry like it was a military operation, and generally being Greg. I, on the other hand, was trying to forget the whole reunion debacle and move on with my life. Spoiler alert, that didn't happen. One evening, after a particularly long day of dealing with clients who thought, "I'll know it when I see it," was a valid design brief, I came home to find Greg sitting at the kitchen table. He had that look on his face, the one that said, "We need to talk." You know the look. It's the same look your boss gives you right before they say, "We're going in a different direction." It's the look that makes your stomach drop and your palms sweat. It's the look that says your life is about to change, and not in a good way. I sat down across from him, my heart pounding like I'd just run a marathon. "What's up?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Like, maybe he just wanted to talk about the weather or the fact that we were out of milk. Greg took a deep breath, which is never a good sign. "Maggie," he said, "there's something I need to tell you." Cue the record scratch. My mind immediately started racing. Was he sick? Did he lose his job? Did he finally realise that organising the pantry by expiration date is not a normal human behaviour? But no, it was none of those things. It was worse. "I'm leaving you," he said, like he was announcing what we were having for dinner. "For Jessica." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. Because this had to be a joke, right? Like, maybe he was pranking me. Or maybe he'd hit his head and was temporarily delusional. But no, he was serious. Dead serious. "Wait, what?" I said, because apparently my brain had short-circuited and that was the best I could come up with. Greg sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable. "Jessica and we reconnected at the reunion, and I realised that I never stopped loving her. I need to follow my heart, Maggie." Follow his heart? Follow his heart? What is this, a Hallmark movie? I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something. I wanted to flip the table and send his sad oatmeal flying across the room. But instead, I just sat there, staring at him like he'd grown a second head. "So, that's it?" I said, my voice shaking. "You're just leaving? For Jessica?" Greg nodded, like this was the most logical thing in the world. "I'm sorry, Maggie, but this is what I need to do." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him he was being an idiot, that he was throwing away a perfectly good marriage for a woman he hadn't seen in 15 years. But what was the point? He'd already made up his mind. He'd already chosen her over me. So, I did the only thing I could do. I let him go. The next few days were a blur. Greg packed his bags, taking his weirdly organised pantry system with him, and moved in with Jessica. I, on the other hand, was left to pick up the pieces of my life. And let me tell you, those pieces were not pretty. I spent the first week wallowing. I ate ice cream straight from the tub, binge-watched reality TV, and had one-sided conversations with Sir Barkslot, my newly adopted rescue dog. Yes, I got a dog, don't judge me. I needed something to love me unconditionally, and Sir Barkslot was more than happy to oblige. My best friend, Lila, staged an intervention. She showed up at my door with a bottle of wine and a PowerPoint titled, "Why Greg is a Dumbass." It was exactly what I needed. We spent the night drinking wine, eating pizza, and trashing Greg. It was cathartic. But even with Lila's support, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. How could Greg just leave? How could he throw away everything we had for a woman he hadn't seen in 15 years? It didn't make sense. And yet, here we were. The worst part was the little things, like how I'd instinctively reach for his side of the bed in the middle of the night, only to find it empty, or how I'd catch myself making his favourite lasagna, only to remember that he wasn't there to eat it. It was the little things that hurt the most. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. There's nowhere to go but up, and that's exactly what I did. I decided to take this as my villain origin story. I was going to turn my pain into power, my heartbreak into hustle. I was going to become the best version of myself, not for Greg, not for Jessica, but for me. So, I took up salsa dancing, badly, started a candle-making business on Etsy, because why not, and embraced my new life as a single, slightly chaotic woman. And you know what? It felt good. It felt really good. Meanwhile, Greg was living with Jessica, and let's just say it wasn't exactly the fairy tale he'd imagined. But that's a story for another time. So, there I was, freshly divorced, emotionally wrecked, and sitting on my couch in a pair of sweatpants that hadn't seen the inside of a washing machine in way too long. Greg was gone, off living his new life with Jessica, and I was a mess. A hot, sticky, ice cream-covered mess. The first week after Greg left was a blur. I didn't leave the house. I didn't answer my phone. I didn't even bother to brush my hair. I just sat on the couch, surrounded by empty ice cream containers and crumpled tissues, and wallowed. And let me tell you, I wallowed hard. I binge-watched every reality TV show I could find. Real Housewives, 90 Day Fiancé, Love is Blind. You name it, I watched it. And you know what I learned? That no matter how bad my life was, at least I wasn't marrying someone I'd never met in person, or getting into a screaming match over a plate of pasta. Small victories, right? I also ate my weight in junk food. Ice cream, pizza, chips, cookies. If it was bad for me, I ate it. At one point, I found a half-eaten bag of marshmallows in the back of the pantry, which, by the way, was now a disaster zone since Greg wasn't around to organise it, and thought, this is fine. This is a perfectly acceptable dinner. Spoiler alert, it was not fine. Sir Barkslot, my newly adopted rescue dog, was my only companion during this dark time. He's a scrappy little terrier with a face that says, "I've seen things," and a bark that could wake the dead. He quickly became my emotional support animal, my therapist, and my only source of joy. He'd sit next to me on the couch, his head resting on my lap, and listen to me rant about Greg and Jessica like he actually understood what I was saying. And you know what? He never judged me. Not even when I cried into his fur at 2 a.m. because I'd just realised I was out of ice cream. But as much as Sir Barkslot helped, he couldn't fix everything. I was still a mess. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I could hear Greg snoring in the other room, only to remember that he was gone. I'd catch myself making his favourite lasagna, only to realise there was no one to eat it. I'd see a couple holding hands on the street and feel a pang of jealousy so sharp it took my breath away. I was stuck in this endless cycle of sadness and self-pity, and I didn't know how to break free. I felt like I was drowning, like the weight of everything was pulling me under, and I didn't have the strength to fight it. And then my best friend Lila showed up. Lila is the kind of person who doesn't take no for an answer. She's fierce, funny, and fiercely loyal, and she's been my ride or die since we were in college. So, when she showed up at my door with a bottle of wine and a PowerPoint titled, "Why Greg is a Dumbass," I knew I was in for a wild night. She marched into my living room, took one look at the disaster zone I'd created, and said, "Okay, we need to fix this." Then she handed me the wine, opened her laptop, and started the presentation. Slide 1. Greg's top 10 dumbest moments. It was a list of all the ridiculous things Greg had done over the years, from the time he tried to fix the dishwasher with duct tape to the time he got lost in a parking garage and called me crying. By the time Lila got to slide 5, I was laughing so hard I had tears streaming down my face. Slide 2. Why Jessica is the worst. This one was a deep dive into everything wrong with Jessica, from her creepy porcelain doll collection to her habit of flipping her hair like she was in a shampoo commercial. Lila even included a photo of Jessica from the reunion, with the caption, "Who wears red to a high school reunion? A monster, that's who." Slide 3. Maggie's glow-up plan. This was where Lila got serious. She outlined a step-by-step plan for me to get my life back on track, complete with goals like adopt a dog, already done, start a new hobby, and get revenge by living your best life. By the end of the presentation, I felt better. Not great, but better. Lila had reminded me that I was still me, that I was still strong and capable and worthy of love, even if Greg couldn't see it. And she'd given me a roadmap to start rebuilding my life. So, with Lila's help, I started to pick up the pieces. I cleaned my apartment, well, most of it, threw out the empty ice cream containers and put on a pair of pants that weren't sweatpants. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And then I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Greg's stupid decision define me. I wasn't going to be the sad divorcee who sat around feeling sorry for herself. No, I was going to be the iconic divorcee, the kind of woman who turns her pain into power and comes out stronger on the other side. It wasn't going to be easy, but I was ready. Or at least, I was ready to try. So, after my week-long pity party, sponsored by Ben & Jerry's and Real Housewives, I decided it was time to get my life together. Or at least, time to pretend I was getting my life together. Because let's be real, I was still a mess. But I was a mess with a plan. And that plan was to become the best version of myself. Not for Greg, not for Jessica, but for me. The first step in my grand glow-up plan was to find a new hobby. Something that would distract me from the fact that my life was currently a dumpster fire. I considered a few options. Knitting, too boring, yoga, too zen, and gardening, too much responsibility. And then it hit me. Salsa dancing. Now, let me be clear. I have no rhythm, none. I'm the kind of person who claps on the wrong beat at concerts. But salsa dancing seemed fun, and more importantly, it seemed like the kind of thing a confident, independent woman would do. So, I signed up for a beginner's class at the community centre. The first class was a disaster. I showed up in my best workout clothes, which, let's be honest, were just leggings and a t-shirt I'd stolen from Greg, and immediately realised I was in over my head. Everyone else in the class looked like they'd been born with a pair of maracas in their hands, while I looked like I'd been born with 2 left feet. The instructor, a man named Carlos, who was way too enthusiastic for 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, tried to teach me the basic steps. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. I tripped over my own feet, stepped on Carlos's toes, and accidentally elbowed the woman next to me in the face. It was a disaster. But you know what? I laughed. For the first time in weeks, I laughed. And it felt good. The next step in my glow-up plan was to adopt a dog. Because what's more empowering than having a furry little sidekick who loves you unconditionally? So I went to the local animal shelter and met Sir Barks-a-Lot. He's a scrappy little terrier with a face that says, "I've seen things," and a bark that could wake the dead. The moment I saw him, I knew he was the one. Bringing Sir Barks-a-Lot home was the best decision I'd made in a long time. He's my partner in crime, my emotional support animal, and my biggest fan. He's also a great listener. I can rant to him about Greg and Jessica for hours, and he never judges me. Not even when I cry into his fur at 2 a.m, because I've just realised I'm out of wine. With Sir Barks-a-Lot by my side, I started to feel like maybe, just maybe, I could get through this. But I wasn't done yet. The next step in my glow-up plan was to start a side hustle. Because what's more empowering than making money doing something you love? I've always loved candles. There's something so comforting about the flicker of a flame and the smell of something delicious wafting through the air. So I decided to start a candle-making business. I bought a bunch of supplies online, set up a little workspace in my kitchen, and got to work. The first few batches were not great. I accidentally set a towel on fire, spilled wax all over the floor, and created a scent called Burnt Dreams that smelled like regret and failure. But I kept at it. I experimented with different scents, different wicks, different containers, and eventually I started to get the hang of it. I named my business Maggie's Melts and set up an Etsy shop. I came up with hilarious names for my candles, like Midlife Crisis, a blend of coffee, whiskey and regret, X's Tears, a mix of saltwater and spite, and Sir Barks-a-Lot Snuggles, a cosy blend of vanilla and cedarwood. And you know what? People loved them. My shop started getting orders, and before I knew it, I was shipping candles all over the country. As my candle business took off, I started to feel like myself again. Not the sad, broken version of myself that Greg had left behind, but the strong, confident, slightly chaotic version of myself that I'd forgotten existed. I was laughing more, worrying less, and actually looking forward to the future. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any better, I met Ethan. Ethan is a bartender at my favourite local pub. He's laid back, funny, and has a smile that could melt even the coldest heart. We started talking one night when I went in for a drink, and by drink, I mean a giant margarita, and we hit it off immediately. He doesn't care that I'm a mess. In fact, he thinks it's endearing. And he loves Sir Barks-a-Lot, which is a major plus. With Ethan by my side, I started to feel like maybe, just maybe, I was going to be okay. Like maybe Greg leaving me was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because it forced me to rediscover myself, to find my passion, and to realise that I don't need a man to complete me. I just need me. And Sir Barks-a-Lot, of course. So, while I was over here living my best life, salsa dancing badly, making candles, and falling for a hot bartender, Greg was, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly living the dream. Greg had moved in with Jessica, his high school sweetheart, and the woman he'd left me for. And you know what they say? The grass is always greener on the other side, until you realise it's AstroTurf. At first, Greg was thrilled. He was living with the woman he'd been pining over for years, the woman he'd convinced himself was the one. But it didn't take long for the cracks to start showing. For starters, Jessica had a collection of porcelain dolls. And not just a few dolls, mind you. No, this was a full-blown collection. Dozens of them, all staring at you with their creepy, unblinking eyes. Greg told me later that he'd wake up in the middle of the night and swear the dolls were watching him. I mean, can you imagine? Trying to sleep while a bunch of tiny lifeless faces judge you from across the room? It's like something out of a horror movie. Then there was Jessica's diet, or lack thereof. The woman refused to eat anything that wasn't beige. Chicken nuggets, plain pasta, toast, you name it. As long as it was bland and colourless, Jessica was all over it. Greg, who's a bit of a foodie, or at least he likes to think he is, was horrified. He tried to introduce her to new foods, spices, vegetables, flavour, but she wasn't having it. I like what I like, she'd say, and that was that. And don't even get me started on her sock folding obsession. Jessica had a very specific way of folding socks, and if Greg didn't do it exactly right, she'd lose her mind. One time, he folded a pair of socks the wrong way, and she spent an hour lecturing him on the proper technique. I'm not kidding, an hour, about socks. But the real kicker? Jessica wasn't exactly the warm, loving woman Greg remembered from high school. She was, well, let's just say she was high maintenance. She had a temper, a tendency to nitpick, and a habit of making passive-aggressive comments that left Greg feeling like he could never do anything right. It didn't take long for Greg to start missing me. Not that he'd ever admit it, of course, but I could tell. He'd text me things like, "Hey, remember that lasagna you used to make? And I miss Sir Barks a lot." And once, when he was really desperate, he even asked me for advice on how to deal with Jessica's sock folding obsession. I told him to fold them into origami swans. He didn't think it was funny. The truth is, Greg had built Jessica up in his mind as this perfect, idealized version of his first love. But the reality? She was just a person. A flawed, complicated, slightly terrifying person. And Greg was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, he'd made a huge mistake. But here's the thing. I didn't care. Okay, that's not entirely true. Part of me cared. Part of me wanted to rub his face in it to say, "I told you so," to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. But the bigger part of me, the part that had salsa danced her way through heartbreak and built a candle empire from scratch, that part of me was too busy living my best life to worry about Greg. Because here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. It gives you a solid foundation to build something new. And that's exactly what I'd done. I'd taken my pain, my heartbreak, and my anger, and I'd turned it into something beautiful. Something that was entirely mine. And Greg? Well, he was just starting to realize that the grass isn't always greener on the other side. Sometimes it's just AstroTurf. So, after months of thriving, living my best life, and basically becoming the Beyoncé of candle making, Greg finally worked up the courage to ask if we could talk. I'll admit, I was curious. Not because I missed him or anything. Oh no, I was way past that. But because I wanted to see the look on his face when he realized what he had lost. So, I agreed to meet him. We met at a coffee shop because apparently Greg thought neutral ground would make this whole thing less awkward. Spoiler alert, it didn't. I showed up looking fabulous, because of course I did. I was wearing my favourite jeans, a cute top, and a pair of boots that made me feel like a badass. Sir Barks-a-Lot was with me, because, let's be real, he's my emotional support animal, and I wasn't about to face Greg without him. Greg, on the other hand, looked rough. His hair was a mess, his clothes were wrinkled, and he had the kind of dark circles under his eyes that only come from living with a woman who collects creepy porcelain dolls and has a meltdown if you fold the socks wrong. We sat down at the table, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Sir Barks-a-Lot broke the silence by letting out a loud, judgmental bark, which made me smile. Finally, Greg spoke. "Maggie, I just wanted to see how you're doing." I raised an eyebrow. "Really? That's why you wanted to talk? To see how I'm doing?" Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, yeah, and I guess I wanted to say, I'm sorry." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "Sorry for what exactly?" Greg sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "For everything. For leaving you. For not realizing what I had until it was gone. I'll admit, part of me wanted to feel sorry for him. He looked so pathetic, so defeated. But then I remembered all the nights I'd spent crying into Sir Barksalot's fur, all the times I'd questioned my worth because of what he'd done. And that part of me wanted to make him squirm. So I smiled sweetly and said, "Well, Greg, I'm doing great. Better than great, actually. I've got a new boyfriend who actually appreciates me, a booming candle business, and the best dog in the world. So, thanks for asking." Greg's eyes widened. You have a new boyfriend?" I nodded, enjoying the look of shock on his face. "Yep, his name's Ethan. He's a bartender. He's hot, he's funny, and he actually knows how to fold socks without having a meltdown. Oh, and he loves Sir Barksalot." Greg looked like he'd been punched in the gut. I didn't know." I shrugged. "Wow, now you do. Anything else you wanted to say?" Greg hesitated, then said, I miss you, Maggie. I miss us." I leaned forward, looking him straight in the eye. "Well, Greg, that's too bad, because I don't miss you, not even a little bit. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." Greg looked like he was about to cry, but I didn't care. I stood up, grabbed Sir Barksalot's leash, and said, "Good luck with Jessica. And hey, maybe try folding your socks differently. It might help." And with that, I walked out of the coffee shop, head held high, and Sir Barksalot trotting proudly beside me. So, let's talk about my victory lap. Because, honey, it was everything. After my confrontation with Greg, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I'd said my piece, stood my ground, and walked away with my head held high. And you know what? It felt amazing. I spent the next few weeks basking in the glow of my newfound confidence. My candle business, Maggie's Melts, was thriving. Orders were pouring in faster than I could keep up, and my Etsy shop was getting rave reviews. People loved my candles, especially the ones with the hilarious names like Midlife Crisis and Ex's Tears. I even got a few custom orders from people who wanted candles named after their own exes. Pro tip, Cheater's Regret is a bestseller. Sir Barksalot was living his best life too. He'd become a local celebrity thanks to the Instagram account I'd made for him. At Sir Barksalot, if you're curious. He's got more followers than I do. People loved his tiny hats and his sassy captions, and he'd even started getting sponsorship offers from pet brands. My little scrappy terrier was a star, and I couldn't have been prouder. And then there was Ethan. Sweet, funny, laid-back Ethan. He was everything Greg wasn't. Kind, supportive, and genuinely interested in me for who I was. He didn't care that I was a mess. In fact, he thought it was endearing. He'd come over after his shifts at the bar, and we'd spend hours talking and laughing, with Sir Barksalot curled up at our feet. It was the kind of relationship I'd always wanted, but never thought I'd have. But the best part of my victory lap? The sense of peace I felt. For the first time in a long time, I was truly happy. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. I'd taken my pain, my heartbreak, and my anger, and I turned it into something beautiful, something that was entirely mine. I'd also learned a lot about myself along the way. I'd learned that I was stronger than I thought, that I didn't need a man to complete me, and that sometimes the best revenge is living your best life. And you know what? I was living mine. One night, as I sat on my couch with Ethan and Sir Barksalot, surrounded by the warm glow of my candles, I realised something. Greg leaving me was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to rediscover myself, to find my passion, and to realise that I was capable of so much more than I'd ever imagined. And Greg? Well, he was just starting to realise that the grass isn't always greener on the other side. Sometimes it's just AstroTurf. But that's his problem, not mine. After our little coffee shop confrontation, Greg went back to his life with Jessica, and let me tell you, it wasn't pretty. Jessica, as it turns out, was not the perfect, idealised woman Greg had built her up to be in his head. She was high maintenance, nitpicky, and had a temper that could make a drill sergeant blush. Greg tried to make it work. He really did. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't seem to do anything right. If he folded the socks wrong, Jessica would lose her mind. If he suggested they try a new restaurant, she'd scoff and insist on eating her usual beige, flavourless meals. And don't even get me started on the porcelain dolls. Greg told me later that he'd started having nightmares about them, which, honestly, I found hilarious. The breaking point came one night when Greg accidentally spilled a glass of red wine on Jessica's favourite white rug. You'd think he'd committed a felony the way she reacted. She screamed, she cried, she threw a tantrum that would put a toddler to shame. And Greg? He just stood there, staring at her, wondering how his life had come to this. That's when it hit him. He'd made a huge mistake. Greg started to miss me. Not just the lasagna I used to make, though he definitely missed that, but the little things. The way I'd laugh at his dumb jokes, the way I'd let him organise the pantry to his heart's content, the way I'd always been there for him no matter what. He missed the life we'd built together, the life he'd thrown away for a woman who couldn't even fold socks without having a meltdown. But here's the thing. It was too late. Way too late. Greg tried to reach out to me a few times after our confrontation. He'd text me things like, "Hey, how's Sir Barks-a-Lot?" and "I miss your lasagna." But I didn't respond, not because I was being petty. Okay, maybe a little, but because I didn't have anything left to say to him. I'd moved on, and I wasn't about to let him drag me back into his mess. Eventually, Greg stopped trying. He realised that I wasn't going to give him the closure he was looking for, and he was going to have to live with the consequences of his choices. And you know what? That's exactly what he did. Greg stayed with Jessica, but it wasn't the happy ending he'd imagined. They fought constantly, and Greg spent most of his time walking on eggshells, trying not to set her off. He'd become a shell of the man he used to be, and it was all because of the choices he'd made. But here's the thing. I didn't feel sorry for him. Not even a little bit. Greg had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. Here we are. The end of the story. The part where I get to wrap everything up with a nice little bow and deliver the final punchline. Because, let's be real, this whole thing has been one big cosmic joke, and I'm the one who gets the last laugh. It's a quiet evening, and I'm sitting on my couch with Ethan and Sir Barks-a-Lot. The room is bathed in the warm glow of my candles, specifically the one called Midlife Crisis, which smells like coffee, whiskey, and just a hint of spite. Ethan is flipping through a cookbook, looking for inspiration for our next dinner date. He's been trying to impress me with his culinary skills, which are, let's just say, a work in progress. Sir Barks-a-Lot is curled up at my feet, snoring softly, his tiny hat slightly askew. As I sit there, surrounded by the people, and dog, who mean the most to me, I can't help but reflect on everything that's happened. The heartbreak, the chaos, the salsa dancing disasters, the candle-making triumphs. It's been a wild ride, but you know what? I wouldn't change a thing. Because here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. It gives you a solid foundation to build something new. And that's exactly what I've done. I've taken my pain, my heartbreak, and my anger, and I've turned it into something beautiful. Something that's entirely mine. I've built a life that I'm proud of. A life that's full of love, laughter, and the occasional salsa-related injury. A life that's mine, and no one else's. And Greg? Well, Greg is still out there, living his life with Jessica. From what I've heard, it's not exactly the fairy tale he'd imagined, but that's not my problem anymore. Greg made his choices, and now he has to live with them. As for me, I'm just getting started. I've got big plans for Maggie's Melts. New scents, new designs, maybe even a brick and mortar store someday. I've got Ethan, who's been my rock through all of this, and Sir Barks-a-Lot, who's my partner in crime and my biggest fan. And I've got myself. Strong, confident, slightly chaotic me. So, here's the final punchline. Greg divorced me for his first love, but joke's on him. I'm the one living the dream, and honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way.